first model I want to consider, which allows us to evaluate strategies and decide whether they are appropriate for what we're trying to achieve, is a way of looking at the various objectives and goals we produce, the strategies that come out of the TOES matrix, and comparing them with the needs of our stakeholders and what are their interests. And this is known as the Maslin multidimensional matrix. It, broadly speaking, came about because there was a tendency to use the Boston Consulting Group matrix, which you may be familiar with, which allows you to break items down into whether they have high market share or high market growth, and compare them. Those items with high market share and high market growth are seen as being stars, or those items with high market share but low market growth may well be seen as cash cows, etc. And there was a very simplistic way of approaching the private sector and deciding very much based on marketing and pricing policies as to whether you should continue with particular products or not. And there was an attempt to use this, as has been noted throughout, and transfer it to the public sector. We have to be aware of the fact there's a strong tendency, a lot of it is for economic purposes, due to the declining rate of profit, the idea of models as technology, and therefore if you think of them as a machine that has to be flogged and overused and run over a number of different users in order to try and get the value of creating it back into new markets, which is not appropriate, and therefore it started to fall apart. It was not working very well, and when people looked at it and said that actually there was a need, however, to have a way of grouping policies, and it was there to decide that what was actually best was a multidimensional approach rather than just a market share, a market growth approach. And they came up with this, and effectively you take your strategies and you level them between 1 and 5 against the needs and wants of your client group and against a series of user defined dimensions, and then you plot them on the matrix, and you're basically looking to see which of the 4 quadrants it will fall into, which we'll look at great detail later. But basically, should it fall in the bottom left-hand corner, low desire for the users, low desire for your client groups, the sort of thing you withdraw from. If it falls in the higher end on the right-hand side of the matrix, you're looking at the continue but monitor. Those things that may be of use to your use-defined dimension, we're talking about like maybe the taxpayers, the politicians, etc., the stakeholders you identified earlier on. It may be something that's of interest of them, and this may relate, of course, to their level of powers and interests. You may well, if they want it to continue, but it isn't meeting the needs of the client group, therefore we must in some way rematch this. We must lobby it and change it in some way to make it more appropriate for the client group while still maintaining the interest that the stakeholders have in it. But if it is something that the clients are very interested in, or the public sector, the receipt of your services, the receipt of, for instance, if you're a non-governmental organisation, if you're the government, but it isn't meeting the needs of your stakeholders. Use-defined dimensions relates to your stakeholders. Needs wants relates to one particular stakeholder, the receiver, the receiver of the service or the good or the property or the ideas that you're producing. Then you may want to review and evaluate it, and you may want to have a series of these doing that. That's why it's multidimensional, in which you plot them one on top of the other. So we've developed needs wants of client group. It's quite important to take views of things of this. The Boston Consulting Group matrix, the source of this, is a classic neoliberal matrix based on neoliberal economics, in which we talk rational actors making rational decisions. But in fact, the needs wants of a client group is very, very subjective. It's also important to remember that it might be a want, maybe all in the mind. If a client wants housing but they cannot afford to pay for it, then you would say, well, actually, in economic terms, that is not something that is an economic want. However, we're moving away here from economic terms. We're talking about the public sector. And so, for instance, housing is an example of that. The state may have definitions of what people need that will entitle them to receipt of a service they cannot otherwise afford to pay for. So they may have need of something. And if they can prove their need to the state, the neutrality of the state may well provide them with housing, it may provide them with transport, it may provide them with education, it may provide them with healthcare. So in fact, in this situation, although in pure economic terms we're looking for things that people can afford to pay for, the provision of such the public, it may be given form to the one that is in their mind by policy. Therefore, if the state or if the player, if the non-governmental organisation decides it wants to provide a service, then that want that otherwise would not be satisfied may well become a genuine need or a genuine economic want, but in terms other than simply the ability to purchase. So we're already starting to see a fall in the neoliberal, neoclassical economic approach once you start to involve the state sector, despite the fact that there's much pressure in the state sector these days, as you have studied new public finance to understand, to actually marketize everything. So as long as you take a very careful approach to signing this axis, you must be realistic about what it is your client groups want and need. Once it's signed, therefore, you have to compare it to a number of user-defined dimensions, and the users that we're talking about here are the stakeholders in your product. What might they may be? Well, they could be things like the concerns of the politicians. These may be high power, but effectively low interest. So therefore, your concerns might be, let's not get them too interested. Let's not get to a situation in which they want to get involved or they feel the need to get involved. So you have your concerns of your politicians. Your general community concerns, again, these may be people of low power but higher interest. How do you make sure that they don't start to mobilize themselves? They don't start to get people don't start to get angry. That's how do you keep up with those? Could be the general government, talking about separate away from the individual local politicians. It could be the national government. It could be those who do alternative provisions. It could well be private sector people who feel they're being pushed out by state sector provision. You only have to look at Obamacare or something like that to see how many private corporations reacted angrily towards the provision of cheap, free health care for the poor. It could be the interests of finance, how they're getting a fair return on their investments, etc. It could be non-financial resource providers. It could be staff expertise. Is it something that they're actually good at, something they like doing that is being provided? Could be a statutory duty. They may be required to provide certain products to them, so therefore they need to provide something to the client group that meets their statutory duty. For instance, and therefore you can have disputes over, for instance, the provision of school meals or what constitutes a decent balanced meal. You have disputes over what our students provide. It may well be that you're trying to do something on the cheap, because simply to meet the statutory duty you have as a stakeholder, as a provider, whereas other people are saying, actually, no, this is not correct. You're not providing something of sufficient nutritional value or sufficient safety, etc. So these are all arguments of doing that. Does it tie your current activities? Is it something you can do with what you've already got, or do you need to provide extra, possibly expensive circumstances? And undoubtedly, you will think of many, many more as you go through it. So what do these four quadrants mean? Let's be clear about this. They are inherently political in their outlook. The approaches suggest might be just socialist, they might be domesticist, they might be need for flexibility and engaged intelligence you're looking about it. They may also reflect that there are certain things that you feel are both wanted but not actually needed. The classic that always comes up in Britain is community policing. British people want bobbies on the beat. They want police they can see. Yet the police themselves will argue that most of their good policing is intelligence-based policing, in which they know they investigate where crimes are likely to commit, they commit resources there, they catch people. People often want something that is not effective. So you may well be that actually community policing meets the needs of politicians, so it should therefore fully continue but monitor, but it doesn't really meet the needs of local community who actually want the crime stopped, so it falls within lobby and rematch. And therefore you get a contradiction between the two. You have one thing which is the provision of police on the beat, which may well be what is needed in order to provide a service, but actually this falls under lobby and rematch in the hope that it would reach the things. The reality is you might say, well, actually, it neither really reaches the needs of the thing, but it actually also does not meet the needs of your client group. So in which case you should sort of withdraw from it. But these are inherently political decisions. There's also cases in which it might well be that the government will provide funding to meet something because it is of interest to them. So for instance, they might actually, as occasionally, throw funds into certain parts of the health service, like for instance, reducing waiting lists. Well, many people have said actually reducing waiting lists was a very poor strategic move on behalf of the government. But because this met the needs of actually having better figures, what actually happened is that many of the NHS trusts broke down admissions hospitals into a number of stages so that you could actually have a wait at each stage. Your total wait might be longer, but no wait at individual point of the waiting list was longer than a certain amount of time. So this actually meant that this might be something that, again, it really should fall into withdrawal because it isn't meeting needs, but because of the inherently political outlook of the people, it actually falls into continue but monitor and therefore continues. And we see this in a number of issues around public sector things. So it's very, very important to recognise this. Another thing that's important to recognise is that the diagonals on the diagram play quite an important role in deciding again whether or not we have something that is stable and something that can probably either be continued easily or can be withdrawn from easily, i.e. is not going to come under a great deal of pressure or stress, whether something's likely to cause a political fight. If we have something that falls in equilibrium, the situation is quite simple. Either it isn't getting neither support from the users, so it's the taxpayers, the politicians, etc., or the user-defined dimension, the stakeholders, or it is, and it is also not really meeting the wants of the client group, so therefore they will withdraw from it, or it is meeting the needs of the stakeholders. It might be cheap, it might be easy to support, it might look good, it might be getting public pressure, and in the same time it's actually bringing down crime, it's actually providing services to things, or in the event of sort of something more geopolitically, it's allowing you to grow yourself abroad while keeping politicians at home able to live on the national impact of things like that. Therefore you have an equilibrium. So for instance, an intervention into a foreign country that is successful can be very equilibrium. The people at home like it because they see their country doing well, if sorts of people come back, sort of being very brave, and the other country starts to become stability, so you get a thing like that. Or even if it's a disaster, then people actually recognize it's a disaster and start to withdraw. Those are basically equilibrium, they're stable, there is very little criticism about them. On the other hand, should it fall in disequilibrium, in one area where, for instance, stakeholders like something, for the stakeholders it's successful, it's achieving something for them, but the client group it is not achieving anything for, it can be difficult to get rid of something. And like I said, quite often funding will be directed to where the stakeholders want it to go. Therefore, it's important to perhaps lobby the stakeholders to rematch the interest, to maybe say, well, if you really want to do this, maybe we need to find another client group for it who is more suitable. Or if you have something that is meeting the needs of a client group, but is, for instance, too expensive or doesn't like stakeholders, and for instance, there's many cases, for instance, dealing with drug users. There are many things that deal with drug users or rehabilitate criminals. People say, oh yes, it's working to rehabilitate criminals, it's actually meeting their needs, but we don't like the fact criminals aren't being treated badly. We don't like the fact that there's rehabilitation rather than punishment. And therefore this is in disequilibrium, and therefore you have to constantly be trying to review it and evaluating it, and you're just trying to justify it, saying, well, actually, this is, even though you don't like the fact we're not mistreating criminals, it is keeping crime down, therefore it is very useful. So therefore things sort of fall into this kind of review and evaluate area because we're in disequilibrium. So disequilibrium is on the diagrams is quite a difficult area to cope with. So what do you actually do in these different areas? Well, we're looking at strategies. If the thing is a case of lobbying rematch, then the strategies you adopt are fairly straightforward. Why are we still doing it? Justify it to yourself. Look, is there a reason for doing this? Whose stakeholders are we meeting? Why are what interests of it that we're doing? What do these stakeholders like? Politicians want good publicity, therefore we have bobbies on the beat. Is there some other way we can give politicians good publicity? For instance, you might be able to do by showing them good falling crime figures. Oh, there's no bobbies on the beat, that looks bad, but actually we are actually bringing crime down elsewhere, therefore that looks good. So find out who is interested, who is it you're trying to reach, who is this being done in their aid of, and see if there are other ways of meeting their interests. Perhaps it's something that you could maybe continue rather than just abandon, you could pass on to someone else. Withdrawal, do you simply abandon it? Is there nobody who this is or is this something that might be appropriate for privatisation and spin-off? It might not be meeting the needs of your client group, but there might be other people who could do it. Same as if you have something like a superfluous strength in which you actually find we're very good at this, but it doesn't, not used to us, well, maybe we can find someone else who can do it. So looking for subgroups who might still be important. Continue but monitor. Interest may vary, so public opinion may change, public opinion may pressure. There may well be people elsewhere monitoring and lobbying to have this changed. So it's all very well to say that at this point in time, the public like us being involved in perhaps this occupation war, the people like us being involved in this foreign investment. The refugee crisis this year was an absolute classic where people have changed moods overnight. One point refugees were welcome, the refugees were not welcome. Again, at the moment refugees are not welcome again, and things are very difficult. You have to balance this. So it's important in the public sector you keep a constant eye on the ever-changing environment, when we've talked quite often about the chaotic and rapidly changing environment that surrounds the strategy, and that to be successful strategists you must be doing that. And for things that fall in this area where it's of need of good, but it's strategies, why are you not doing it? Maybe it might be a question of something you're not doing. It's not always a case of evaluating things you are doing, it might be things you're not doing. Why are you not doing it? Who could do it instead?